The sweet aroma of fried plantains and freshly baked cinnamon bread wafted through the modest home of the Okoros in suburban Atlanta. Grace Okoro stood barefoot on the tiled floor, her fingers gently brushing the strings of her cello, the deep resonance filling the kitchen as her mother, Mama Ebel, hummed a soft Nigerian lullaby in the background. Born to Nigerian immigrants, Grace was the youngest of four and the only girl. Her father, Pastor Benjamin Okoro, had once pastored a small church where she first discovered her voice, literally. She'd been singing in choirs since she was 4, and by 12, her voice could hush a noisy congregation. The cello came later, a gift from a music teacher who saw something extraordinary in her ability to feel music rather than just read it. Despite their modest means, Grace's childhood was filled with harmony, discipline, and reverence for tradition. Her mother ran a home daycare, and her brothers worked odd jobs to help keep the family afloat. Grace, however, had a dream: to sing on stages beyond church halls, to move hearts beyond her neighborhood. But life had different plans. After a near-fatal asthma attack at 17, her parents became overly protective. She promised them she'd stay grounded, finish school, and keep music as a holy hobby. They agreed, on one condition: no shows after dark, no music industry drama, and no deviating from her path of integrity. Adam Wellington had never heard of Grace Okoro when he entered the ArcLight Grand Hotel ballroom for the annual West Coast Tech Gala. Tall, sharply dressed in a navy blue suit with platinum cufflinks, Adam was the quintessential self-made man, or at least that's how he branded himself. Raised in San Diego in a broken, emotionally sterile home, Adam's childhood was a mix of cold stares, absentee parents, and expensive silence. His father, Richard Wellington, was a controlling venture capitalist, and his mother, Claudia, lived at wine tastings and cosmetic clinics more than with her own son. Adam excelled in computer science as a form of escape. By 24, he had built and sold his first startup. By 28, he had a net worth of $10 million. And by 32, he was a sought-after guest at elite tech circles, known for his intelligence and icy confidence. Yet, beneath the surface, Adam feared intimacy, confused love for weakness, and viewed vulnerability as a flaw. That night, he came to the gala expecting to close a deal. What he didn't expect was the woman performing on the ballroom's modest side stage, her voice a rare blend of purity and power, with cello chords so haunting they made the room pause mid-chatter. He didn't hear her name during the performance, but her music followed him home. It was pure coincidence, or fate, that Grace took the last Uber pool from the venue that night, and Adam was in the same car. Dressed in a flowing green gown and holding her cello case tightly to her chest, she seemed both regal and exhausted. Adam sat silently beside her, watching the city blur past the window, unsure why he couldn't stop glancing her way. Finally, he asked, "You played at the gala tonight?" She hesitated before nodding. "Just a fill-in performer. A friend couldn't make it." He replied with something unusually soft for him, "Your music didn't sound like a fill-in. It sounded like the main event." That night turned into coffee, then into long walks discussing dreams and disappointments. Grace was drawn to Adam's precision and intellect, while Adam was disarmed by her empathy and calm. Neither saw the storm ahead. But in that moment, two fractured souls, from entirely different universes, unknowingly started writing a story that would stretch them beyond love, break them past comfort, and test the strength of their spirits. They didn't fall in love that night. But the spark had been struck. And when fire meets kindling, the burn is never predictable. Grace had always been guided by feelings. She trusted her heart more than spreadsheets, her instincts more than strategy. Adam, on the other hand, lived by structure, algorithms, and quantifiable goals. Yet, in the months that followed their first meeting, their opposing worlds didn't clash. They complemented each other in strange, intoxicating ways. Grace loved how Adam listened, even if he didn't always agree. He admired her softness, her ability to forgive, her deep compassion for strangers. She took him to her small church on Sundays where her voice would bring tears to elderly women's eyes. He invited her to elite rooftop tech mixers where everything was glass and gold, and conversations revolved around mergers and patents. Grace would laugh nervously around his colleagues, often unsure what to say. Adam, meanwhile, felt like he was introducing his world to color for the first time when she stood beside him. But cracks began to show when he introduced her to Claudia Wellington, his mother. Claudia didn't hide her disapproval. She looked Grace up and down, commented on her accent, and asked if she was in the country for music school. Grace smiled politely, her hands shaking under the table. Adam said nothing. That silence would haunt her. Over time, Claudia's passive-aggressive remarks became sharper, more frequent. She would invite Adam for solo brunches and conveniently forget to include Grace. On one occasion, she gifted Adam a luxury watch and handed Grace a skin cream with a note that read, "For those dark spots, first impressions matter." Grace never showed Adam the note. Instead, she buried it deep in a drawer alongside other bruises to her self-worth. But her friends saw the changes. Nina warned her gently, "Watch how silence is weaponized, Grace. Sometimes what people don't say says the most." Rachel noticed Grace started singing less during their visits, and the cello gathered dust. Grace insisted she was just adjusting to a different lifestyle. "Adam's not perfect, but he listens," she said. But the listening became less frequent, and the emotional space between them widened with each awkward family dinner and unspoken hurt. Still, when Adam proposed during a quiet weekend getaway in Big Sur, with a ring modest by his standards but thoughtful in design, Grace said yes with teary eyes. She believed love was about compromise, that eventually he would see her soul over society's expectations. But neither of them realized that their compromises had been one-sided all along. The wedding was held at an exclusive vineyard in Napa Valley, elegant and cold, much like the Wellington name itself. Grace's family flew in from Atlanta, wide-eyed and overwhelmed. Her mother wore her finest jelly, and her brothers exchanged anxious glances at the formality of it all. Adam's guests whispered about Grace's modest background, and Claudia wore a smug smile as if she'd won a bet no one else knew about. Grace walked down the aisle with confidence, yet her fingers trembled around her bouquet. As they exchanged vows, Adam promised to protect and prioritize her, to honor her spirit and support her passions. But deep down, Grace wondered if he even knew what her passions truly were anymore. After the ceremony, she snuck away and stood under a vineyard trellis, watching the sun dip beneath the hills. Rachel found her there and whispered, "This isn't the end of your story, Grace. It's just one chapter. Just make sure you're still writing it." That night, in a luxurious suite surrounded by silence, Adam kissed her forehead and told her how lucky he was. But as he drifted into sleep beside her, Grace stared at the ceiling, a strange weight pressing against her chest. She didn't know it yet, but that feeling, that unshakable sense of shrinking, was not just nerves. It was the quiet beginning of a life where her voice, slowly but surely, would begin to disappear. Marriage for Grace became a mosaic of moments, some tender, some disorienting, most quietly complicated. The first few months were blissful on the surface: travel, high-end dinners, moving into their newly purchased smart home in Pacific Heights. But beneath the sheen of success, Grace began feeling like a visitor in her own life. Adam, ever the achiever, worked late into the night, his laptop's glow more familiar than the warmth of her embrace. Conversations shortened. He praised her for being low maintenance and independent, not realizing it wasn't empowerment she felt, but absence. When she brought up pursuing music again, perhaps doing background vocals or teaching at a local center, Adam waved it off with a loving yet dismissive grin. "You don't need that now, Grace. You're in a new league. We're building something bigger." She nodded, swallowing her dreams like bitter pills. She stopped practicing her cello altogether, telling herself she'd pick it up next week, next month. Her fingers grew stiff. Her voice went unused. And with every maybe later, a piece of her brilliance faded in the shadow of what Adam called progress. When Grace found out she was pregnant with Elijah, she didn't cry, she sang. Alone, standing barefoot in the kitchen one morning with a test stick in hand, she hummed a lullaby her mother used to sing. It came out effortlessly, as if her voice had missed her. She couldn't wait to tell Adam. But when she surprised him with the news over dinner, he blinked with what looked like fear before masking it with a tight-lipped smile. "That's early," he muttered, then corrected himself. "I mean, wow, okay. This changes the timeline a bit, but we'll make it work." Grace tried to ignore the disappointment in his voice and focused on preparing the nursery with joy, knitting tiny beanies while playing classical music softly against her belly. She sang to Elijah before he was born, and when he arrived, a beautiful baby boy with bright, curious eyes, she felt a sense of purpose that no mansion, no title, no prestige could rival. She made a silent vow while holding him on her chest in the hospital. "You'll always hear my voice, even if the world goes silent." Grace poured herself into motherhood with a quiet ferocity. She memorized Elijah's sleep cues, tracked every developmental milestone, and sang him to sleep each night with the same lullaby she'd whispered before he was born. Adam, to his credit, tried it first. He built Elijah's crib with a robotic arm design, installed voice-activated lighting, and bought every top-rated baby tech on the market. But his involvement grew more performative than participatory. Board meetings and investor calls took precedence. Even during Elijah's first steps, captured by Grace on a late spring afternoon, Adam only watched the video later that night, smiling distractedly while checking stock updates on his tablet. Grace didn't complain. She convinced herself that he was providing, that his love came in the form of security. But the loneliness deepened. Her dreams of returning to music faded into the background like an abandoned composition. On Elijah's first birthday, Grace organized a small party, inviting just a few neighbors and her friends Nina and Rachel, who had flown in as a surprise. When she picked up the cello and played a soft tune for Elijah while he clapped, Adam walked in, visibly irritated. "You're still playing that thing?" he asked. Grace blinked, stunned. "It's our son's birthday," she said quietly. Adam shrugged, just saying, "It's not exactly Grammy material." That comment stayed with her longer than she admitted. That night, she didn't sing to Elijah. She lay awake in bed, heart aching, wondering when the promises stopped being shared and started becoming sacrifices. Elijah Wellington was no ordinary child. From the moment he could sit upright, he'd tilt his head toward music like a sunflower chasing the sun. Grace noticed it early, how his eyes lit up at melodies, how he'd crawl toward the cello when it rested against the wall, and how he preferred listening over babbling. He wasn't slow to speak, just selective. Grace read dozens of parenting books and consulted pediatricians, but Elijah's silence wasn't alarming, it was peaceful, deliberate. He'd hum before he talked, and his first word wasn't mama or dada, it was song. At 2, he could recite entire verses from lullabies Grace once sang offhandedly. But the first worrying sign came one rainy afternoon when Elijah, then 4, froze mid-dance while they listened to Debussy in the living room. His eyes flickered strangely, body stiff, and then, just as suddenly, he returned to normal. Grace dismissed it as a daydream. But it happened again, and again. Small spells where Elijah would pause, blink as though lost, and then resume play as if nothing occurred. Adam waved it off entirely. "Kid, space out," he said, barely glancing up from his laptop. "Stop diagnosing him with your imagination." Grace tried to push the fear aside, but a storm had already begun brewing quietly in her heart. The first time Elijah trembled in public was during a spelling bee in his kindergarten class. Grace had dressed him in a button-down shirt and braided his curly hair into neat rows. He stood proudly on stage, fingers gripping the microphone, ready to spell giraffe. Halfway through, he stuttered, blinked, then dropped the mic. His little body began to shake, not violently, but noticeably. The teacher rushed to his side, and the auditorium went silent. Grace flew from her seat, her heels echoing on the tile floor as she reached him. Elijah was confused, slightly dazed, but responsive. The nurse wrote it off as low blood sugar. The teacher suggested a follow-up. Adam wasn't there. He had a non-negotiable investor meeting. That night, Grace told him what happened, expecting concern. Instead, he sighed. "Grace, he's just nervous. Stage fright happens to everyone. Don't dramatize." The words sliced through her. That night, Grace lay awake beside a snoring husband, eyes open to the darkness, her instincts louder than ever. Something was wrong with Elijah, and she was the only one who seemed to care enough to see it. Grace became a quiet detective in her own home. She kept a journal titled E under the bed, recording Elijah's odd moments, his sudden pauses, his absent expressions, his rare complaints of dizziness. She noted triggers, flashing lights, long car rides, dehydration. She downloaded neurology articles, subscribed to pediatric forums, and bookmarked specialists she couldn't afford without Adam's approval. But she never showed him the journal. She knew what he'd say. It became their silent battle, Grace's invisible war for her son's health versus Adam's obsession with image and control. Meanwhile, Elijah grew more withdrawn. He was brilliant, able to assemble advanced puzzles and mimic music scales on a toy keyboard, but often looked lost, as though the world around him blurred in and out of focus. Grace started scheduling music tutoring sessions at the local community center under the guise of volunteering, secretly taking Elijah with her so he could be around children in more nurturing spaces. That's where she met Marco, a kind-hearted janitor with EMT experience, who noticed Elijah's distant stares and offered subtle advice. "That boy needs checking." "It's not just daydreaming, ma'am," he said, his eyes warm but serious. Grace nodded, swallowing hard. She didn't cry, not then. But that night, while washing Elijah's pajamas, she heard herself hum a tune she hadn't sung in years. Her voice cracked midway. Not from disuse. From grief. Because deep down, she knew this wasn't going away. And she was running out of time to be heard. Grace had always believed that isolation was a choice until marriage taught her it could be a condition. In the early years, she rarely saw her old friends, weddings, baby showers, birthdays. Adam always had a reason why she shouldn't go. "They're not on your level anymore," he'd say. Or, "What do you even have in common with them now?" Slowly, her social calendar went dry, her voice messages unanswered, and her nights quiet except for the sounds of Elijah's soft breathing and the occasional clink of Adam's whiskey glass. But friendship, true friendship, doesn't evaporate, it waits. Nina Douglas had been Grace's college roommate, a bold, fiery single mom who worked 2 jobs and still made time to check on Grace via random voice notes. "I know you're busy being fabulous," she'd say, "but don't make me show up at your door with hot wings and gossip." Grace smiled every time, even if she didn't respond. But it wasn't until Nina popped up unannounced one Wednesday evening with her son in tow that the dam began to crack. Elijah and Nina's son, Micah, clicked instantly over Legos and cartoons, and as the boys giggled on the living room floor, Nina took one look at Grace's face and said, "You're drowning and don't even realize it." They talked long into the night. Nina didn't pry, she listened. She watched Grace fidget with her fingers, listened to the sighs between her sentences, and didn't interrupt when Grace finally whispered, "I think something's wrong with Elijah." Nina, a licensed therapist by profession, didn't jump to diagnose. "Instead," she said, "follow your instincts. They've never lied to you. But also, don't carry this alone." She introduced Grace to her own circle, a small support group of women who met twice a month at a quiet bakery run by an old Haitian woman named Madame Laurel. There, Grace met Rachel Mensah, a music teacher and divorced mother of twins, who immediately recognized the rust in Grace's voice when she hummed absent-mindedly during a group exercise. "You used to sing," Rachel said. It wasn't a question. Grace nodded, ashamed. "I used to be a lot of things," she murmured. That night, Rachel gave her a small booklet of vocal warm-ups and said, "Let's find her again. The woman who used to sing." Grace laughed awkwardly but took the booklet. It sat untouched on her nightstand for weeks. But something had shifted. For the first time in years, someone saw the artist in her, not just the mother, not just the wife, not just the silence between Adam's cold stares and Elijah's hidden struggles. It felt like being remembered. Adam, however, noticed the shift. He came home one evening to find Grace cooking while humming a soft tune from their early days. He didn't comment, just narrowed his eyes and changed the music playing from the speakers to one of his curated productivity playlists. When Grace mentioned she had met with a few women from the community, Adam scoffed. "You're wasting your time with pity parties," he said, pouring himself a drink. "Support groups are for weak minds." The word stung, but Grace said nothing. That night, she sat in bed staring at her reflection. Who had she become? Why did his opinion still matter so much? But the next morning, she still went to the group. She still texted Nina back. She still listened to Rachel's voice notes, sometimes replaying them like lullabies for herself. It was small, barely visible resistance. But it was hers. With each gathering, each cup of tea passed in compassion, each laugh, each shared silence, Grace began to feel something she hadn't in a long time, grounded. The friendships weren't just saving her sanity, they were quietly rebuilding her identity. Brick by brick. Voice by voice. Even if Adam couldn't see it, even if the world around her remained indifferent, Grace had found her secret haven. And in that haven, seeds of strength were beginning to sprout. The invitation was printed on heavy ivory cardstock, embossed in gold lettering with the Wellington family crest delicately pressed into the corner, a subtle reminder of the lineage Adam took pride in but rarely acknowledged out loud. The West Coast Innovators Gala was the kind of event that made tech headlines, reserved for billionaires, venture capitalists, and polished startup stars. Adam was one of the keynote guests that year, scheduled to unveil his company's latest AI prototype, a project he'd buried himself in for over 16 months. When he told Grace they'd be hosting the exclusive after-party in their home, she blinked, surprised. "Our home?" she asked gently, holding Elijah's dinner spoon midair. "Wouldn't the Four Seasons be better equipped?" Adam's eyes darkened. "This isn't just about tech. It's about legacy. It needs to feel personal." Grace swallowed her thoughts. She knew better than to question Adam's decisions when it came to appearances. For the next week, staff poured in and out of the house, interior decorators, caterers, private security, even a valet company. Grace was asked to just stay out of the way, though she still managed to oversee Elijah's schedule and coordinate the staff's timing. On the day of the event, she wore a floor-length navy blue gown, simple but elegant, paired with pearls her mother had passed down. As she stepped into the ballroom-sized living room filled with soft jazz and whispers of capital investments, she felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She didn't belong here. Not really. Grace moved quietly through the crowd, offering polite smiles and brief nods to people whose names she couldn't pronounce, let alone remember. Adam floated from circle to circle like a seasoned diplomat, his hand firmly in the pocket of his tailored tuxedo, the other gesturing animatedly as he discussed his company's future. Grace caught snatches of conversation, IPO projections, neural sync hardware, Wellington's genius, but her mind was elsewhere. She'd received a call earlier that day from Elijah's teacher, Ms. Callahan, mentioning another fainting incident. "He was okay after a few minutes," she had said, "but Grace, I think you should take him in for an EEG. It's not the first time." Grace's heart had sunk. Elijah hadn't mentioned it. She tried calling Adam 3 times but got no response. Now, watching him bask in praise and applause, she felt a pang of fury simmer beneath her ribs. When the speeches ended and the champagne glasses clinked, Grace gently pulled Adam aside to the hallway. "We need to talk," she whispered. Adam glanced down at her, annoyed. "Now?" She nodded. "It's Elijah. There was another episode. At school." Adam stared at her, expression unreadable. "Why are you bringing this up here?" he snapped under his breath. "You really don't know when to shut off." And just like that, something in Grace cracked. The party went on, music swelling, laughter echoing. But behind the closed door of Adam's home office, Grace and Adam stood face to face, the air between them electric with tension. "Our son could be having seizures, and you don't even blink," she said, her voice shaking. "I'm not imagining it, Adam. He's not well." Adam scoffed and poured himself another drink. "You want to ruin my night with another one of your theories? Kids fall. Kids faint. Stop acting like everything is a crisis." Grace took a step back, as if physically wounded. "He needs a scan. He needs a diagnosis. He needs you." Adam's voice was calm, too calm. "He has you. That's what you're good for." She stared at him, heart thudding. Before she could respond, a sharp crack echoed. The glass in Adam's hand had shattered under his grip, shards falling onto the mahogany floor. "Don't push me, Grace," he said softly, dangerously. "This night means everything." She picked up her heels, turned without a word, and walked out barefoot past the guests, her smile tight, her spine rigid. No one noticed her eyes brimming with tears. That night, while the last guest departed and Adam celebrated his business triumph alone in the study, Grace stood in Elijah's room, watching him sleep. She realized that the man she married wasn't ignoring her out of stress, he had simply stopped caring. And worse, he didn't even know it. It happened on a Tuesday morning, overcast, cool, and seemingly uneventful. Grace had just finished tuning a cello at the community center where she volunteered to teach children from underfunded schools when her phone buzzed violently in her pocket. It was the school nurse. "Mrs. Wellington," came the breathless voice, "you need to come to St. Clement's Elementary. Elijah, he had a seizure." Time stopped. Her ears rang, her limbs turned to ice. She dropped the tuning bow, barely remembering to grab her coat before bolting for the door. The drive felt eternal. Every red light was a betrayal. She prayed out loud between sobs, whispering fragments of psalms, gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. When she arrived, the sight of Elijah lying on the infirmary cot, pale, eyes fluttering, a cold compress on his forehead, nearly broke her. Miss Callahan was by his side, holding his small hand. He collapsed during his history presentation, she explained, voice shaking. There were tremors, clenched fists, full body stiffness. The paramedics came, but he regained consciousness before they arrived. Grace knelt beside her son and kissed his forehead. I'm here, baby. I'm here. But inside, she was falling apart. She dialed Adam's number 3 times from the nurse's office, her thumb trembling on the screen. On the 4th try, he picked up. What is it? Came his flat voice. Grace wiped her tears and said, It's Elijah. He had a seizure at school. We're at the nurse's station. I need you to come. A long pause followed. She could hear the background chatter of an office meeting and the clink of a glass being set down. Grace, I'm in the middle of something critical. Is he stable? He asked. He's awake, but he needs to go to the ER. He needs a scan, she replied, voice cracking. Adam sighed. Then take him. I'll check in later. And with that, he ended the call. Grace stared at the phone like it had betrayed her. No panic, no questions, no urgency. Just cold detachment. The nurse watched her with pity but said nothing. Grace turned to Elijah, whose eyes slowly opened. He looked confused, disoriented. Mommy, he whispered. Why was I sleeping in class? She pulled him close, tears streaming down her cheeks. Because your brain needed a little break, baby. But I've got you. And she meant it. She would carry him through fire if she had to, alone. At the hospital, doctors ordered immediate blood work, neurological exams, and a precautionary MRI. The ER was cold, crowded, and filled with the sterile scent of antiseptics and dread. Grace answered every question with efficiency, dates of prior fainting spells, food allergies, family history, though the only family member that mattered was absent. As Elijah lay beneath a thin blanket, his tiny fingers twitching even in sleep, Grace sat beside him, eyes fixed on the ceiling, her mind spinning like a carousel of worst-case scenarios. When the doctor finally returned, he didn't smile. We need to refer you to pediatric neurology, he said carefully. It's likely a seizure disorder, possibly epilepsy, but we'll need more scans to confirm. For now, keep him hydrated, rested, and away from visual triggers like flashing lights or stress. Grace nodded slowly, absorbing each word like shards of glass. On the ride home, Elijah slept, curled up in the back seat like a curled leaf after rainfall. Grace didn't cry. Not then. She drove in silence, her hands tight on the wheel, and her gaze vacant. At home, she tucked him into bed and sat by his side until his breathing evened. Only when the house was silent did she allow herself to unravel. She collapsed on the floor beside his bed, curled into herself, and wept, not just because of the seizure. Not just because her son was sick. But because she had finally seen it clearly, she was married to a man who would never choose them. Not even in crisis. And that truth burned hotter than any fire she'd ever known. The next morning, the sun rose behind storm clouds, and the house felt as cold and hollow as Grace had ever known it. She hadn't slept. Elijah was still resting, worn out from the seizure and medications. Grace had spent the night sitting on the floor beside his bed, her fingers laced together in prayer and dread. She knew she had to speak to Adam face to face, not through a call, not in a hallway, but in their home, like people who once shared a life. When Adam returned that morning, dressed in a pristine navy suit, his only concern was whether the valet scratched his Tesla. Grace followed him into the kitchen, where he began making coffee as if nothing had happened. Adam, she said, her voice low but firm, we need to talk about Elijah. His doctors are referring him to pediatric neurology. They think it's a seizure disorder. Adam stirred his coffee slowly, his back to her. So? What do you want me to do about it? Grace froze. What do I want you to do? She echoed in disbelief. I want you to care. I want you to act like you have a son who is sick and needs both his parents. Adam turned to her then, face unreadable. I'm not a doctor, Grace. I'm not going to spiral because a few medical interns are tossing words like seizure disorder around. You've always been dramatic. Grace clenched the edge of the counter, grounding herself. This isn't about drama. Elijah is having real episodes. He needs consistent care, possibly medication, specialists, things that cost time, money, and support. And I can't do it alone. Adam leaned against the counter and sipped his coffee, unfazed. You're the one who wanted to stay home and be Mother Teresa. Now live with it. I'm running a company, Grace. I don't have time for sick days and emotional meltdowns. Her heart dropped. You're talking about our son, she said slowly, trembling. Not a project. Not an expense report. Your son. Adam laughed dryly, shaking his head. He's become a distraction. You both have. Do you realize how many deals I've had to delay because of your endless panic attacks about bedtime coughs and school nurse calls? Grace's mouth fell open, her words caught in her throat. You think we're a burden? She finally whispered. Adam's expression darkened. No. I know you are. And I'm done pretending otherwise. There it was. Naked. Cold. Cruel. Not shouted in anger, but delivered with surgical precision, the kind that wounds deeper than rage ever could. The silence that followed was unbearable. Grace stood frozen in the kitchen, her hands shaking, her knees barely holding her upright. Adam walked past her toward the hallway, taking off his jacket and tossing it over the couch with complete indifference. You can stay until the end of the week, he muttered. But I want you both out after that. I'll have my assistant draft something clean. I'll transfer a one-time payment for Elijah's future needs and you can figure out the rest. Grace didn't move. She couldn't breathe. It felt like her entire world collapsed in one sentence. You're throwing us out, she said, not believing her own voice. Adam didn't even turn back. This house is mine. The business is mine. The life I built, I did it without your cello lullabies and your sickly child pulling at my sleeves. So yes, Grace. Leave. You were never meant to last in this world. Something inside her broke. Not like shattered glass, but like the quiet rupture of a dam, a kind of break that doesn't scream but drowns. That night, after packing a suitcase for herself and a small backpack for Elijah, Grace stood in the driveway, staring at the home that once held promises, now emptied of love. Elijah clung to her side, still groggy. The rain had begun to fall, soft and cruel. No one came out to stop her. No one said goodbye. She walked away with everything that mattered, her son, her silence, and the fragments of a voice that the world hadn't heard in years. But one day, it would. Grace hadn't planned where she'd go. When she stepped off the public bus at nearly midnight, suitcase dragging behind her, Elijah leaning sleepily against her hip, her fingers trembled over the screen of her phone as she scrolled for the only person she could call without hesitation, Rachel Mensah. The music teacher answered immediately, her voice groggy but alarmed. Grace? What's wrong? Where are you? Within 30 minutes, Rachel had opened the door of her modest apartment in Eastwood and pulled them both inside without a single question. Her living room was cluttered with sheet music, toy blocks from her twins, and warm lights that didn't hum like Adam's mansion did, they glowed like safety. Rachel made up the couch with soft blankets and whispered, "Rest now. We'll talk later." That night, as Elijah lay on her chest snoring softly, Grace cried into her son's curls. Not loud sobs, just the quiet, aching kind. The kind that shake your body without a sound. The kind that come from being discarded. Betrayed. Forgotten. In that moment, she felt like a ghost in her own life, floating between who she used to be and who she'd have to become if she ever wanted to rise again. Morning came with the scent of cinnamon rolls and a chorus of toy drums from Rachel's twins, Kimmy and Kobe, who giggled when Elijah shyly peeked his head out from under the blanket. Rachel sat Grace down with coffee and toast. No questions. Just talk, she said, calm but firm. Grace unraveled it all, the seizure, the ER visit, Adam's brutal words, the eviction. Rachel listened, her expression tight with fury but patient with empathy. You're staying as long as you need, she said. Don't argue. But Grace did worry. She couldn't live indefinitely on a friend's couch, especially with Elijah's condition worsening. She began searching online for shelters and free clinics, her fingers trembling as she filled out forms. That afternoon, Elijah had another brief episode while watching a cartoon. It lasted less than a minute, but Grace fell apart. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing as Rachel held her. "You can't do this alone," Rachel said again, this time more urgently. And fate, as if answering, knocked on the door. It was Marco, the former EMT janitor from the community center. He lived in the building, had seen Rachel's door ajar, and noticed Grace's face from earlier music sessions. "Heard you're going through something," he said gently. "I might know someone who can help." Marco introduced her that evening to Ms. Karen Rollins, a soft-spoken, retired social worker who ran a neighborhood health collective for underinsured families. Through her, Grace was guided to a free neurologist consultation for Elijah and introduced to a therapy support group for emotionally displaced women, exactly what Grace was too ashamed to seek herself. There, surrounded by women whose eyes told stories of betrayal, survival, and lost homes, Grace began to unravel safely. In one of the sessions, while she spoke softly about Elijah's condition and Adam's abandonment, another woman handed her a business card for a local nonprofit pharmacy. "They'll help with seizure meds. They helped me when my daughter had hers," she said. That night, as she tucked Elijah into Rachel's couch, Grace felt something that she hadn't tasted in weeks: oxygen. She wasn't healed. She wasn't whole. But for the first time since Adam told her she was a burden, she realized she still existed outside of his world. She kissed Elijah's forehead and sat in the dark living room, cello tucked in the corner untouched, phone silenced. Her life had shattered. But at least now, among the broken pieces, hands were reaching out to help her rebuild. The therapy room was nothing like Grace expected. There were no sterile couches or interrogative stares. Instead, soft earth tones, diffused lavender light, and a corner bookshelf filled with titles on healing, grief, and resilience. A large window overlooked a quiet garden blooming with wildflowers. It felt less like a doctor's office and more like a sanctuary. Dr. Lindsay Rhodes, the therapist Marco referred her to, was a gentle woman in her early 50s with salt and pepper hair twisted into a soft bun and eyes that saw too much but never judged. From the first moment they met, Grace felt exposed, as if every unspoken ache and every tear she'd swallowed for years suddenly became visible. She sat stiffly on the plush armchair, holding her hands like a prisoner awaiting trial. Dr. Rhodes didn't probe. She waited. And eventually, Grace began to speak, not about Adam at first, but about the music. About how her cello had been silent for months, how she feared her voice had vanished for good. Then came the breakdown. A sudden, choking confession about Elijah's diagnosis and the guilt that had been anchoring her heart. "I failed him," she whispered, tears spilling. "I didn't fight hard enough. I let my husband call him a burden and said nothing." Dr. Rhodes offered no platitudes, only stillness. "You've been surviving," she finally said. "Now it's time to live." Grace continued her sessions weekly, and little by little, the numbness began to melt. She spoke about her father, Pastor Benjamin, and the warmth of choir rehearsals in Atlanta. She talked about the silence that swallowed her after marriage and how Adam's disapproval didn't just mute her music, it muted her soul. Dr. Rhodes asked her to do one thing: sing. Not for the world. Not for performance. Just for herself. Start in the mirror. One note. One breath, she advised. Grace resisted. Her voice felt like a rusted instrument, fragile and sharp-edged. But one evening, after another short seizure Elijah had during a midday nap, his fourth in 2 weeks, Grace sat in the bathroom, shut the door, and whispered to him. Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. She cried through the verses, grieving the years she'd been silenced. On the other side of that bathroom door, a new version of her was waiting. She wasn't fully ready to meet that woman yet, but she was inching closer. Meanwhile, Elijah was referred to a pediatric epilepsy specialist, and the early tests confirmed a diagnosis: focal epilepsy with occasional generalization. It was manageable. But it wouldn't be easy. Grace didn't cry at the diagnosis. She'd already mourned. Now she was ready to fight, with sound, with softness, with every note she'd once buried. Outside therapy, Grace found unexpected solace in the growing friendship between Elijah and Zoe, Marco's 11-year-old niece. Zoe was sharp-tongued, bright-eyed, and lived with epilepsy herself. She was the first child Elijah had met who understood the blinking confusion and post-seizure exhaustion. "I call it brain hiccups," Zoe told him during one of their playdates, shrugging as she painted cartoons of neurons with capes. Grace watched them from the window with a fragile sense of hope. Zoe's mother, Tamika, shared helpful tips, diet adjustments, stress triggers, even free breathing workshops at the local youth center. For the first time in months, Grace didn't feel like she was drowning. She was still in deep water, yes, but now she had others swimming beside her. One quiet afternoon, Rachel dropped by and noticed the cello still untouched in the corner. "What are you waiting for?" she asked. Grace smiled faintly. "Permission, I guess." Rachel gently touched her arm. "Then here it is." That night, after Elijah fell asleep and the house fell quiet, Grace opened the cello case. Her hands trembled as she tightened the strings. She didn't play, not yet. But she tuned it. She cleaned it. She held it against her body like an old friend finally come home. The tremors hadn't just been Elijah's, they'd lived in her too. But now, therapy was not only helping her son, it was awakening the woman she'd nearly lost forever. It started as therapy homework. Dr. Rhodes asked Grace to write without intention. No edits. No structure. No expectation that it would be read or shared. Just pour out the truths she was too afraid to speak. What began as a reluctant journaling exercise quickly transformed into a series of raw, unsent letters. The first was addressed to Adam. "Dear Adam," she wrote, "I hope one day you sit alone in silence and realize that power and pride were never substitutes for presence." She didn't write it to hurt him, but to expel the venom left behind. The next letter was to Elijah. "My sweet boy, you were never a burden. You were the light in every dark room. If the world fails you, I never will." She cried while writing that one. Her tears smeared the ink, but she didn't start over. She wrote to her father too. "Daddy, I wish you were here. I wish you could hear me sing again. I wish I hadn't buried my gifts under someone else's shadow." The more she wrote, the more her heart exhaled. Each letter wasn't just a memory, it was a piece of her that needed closure. She placed them in a small wooden box Marco had gifted her, a music box he found in an antique store, the kind that played soft notes when opened. Grace didn't play the music. Not yet. That would come later. The letters grew over the next several weeks, more to herself than anyone else. Some were angry, "Why didn't you run sooner?" Others were forgiving, "You tried your best, and that was enough." But the most painful were the ones addressed to the version of herself she had lost in marriage. "You were full of light. You were whole. And I let someone take pieces of you, one by one, while I called it love." Writing these wasn't easy. Grace often paused mid-sentence, paralyzed by memories she hadn't yet named. But in writing, she discovered something no one had told her. Closure didn't come from confrontation, it came from release. One afternoon, as she wrote a final letter titled "To the Silence," she realized her hands no longer trembled when picking up a pen. Her breath no longer caught in her chest when she spoke of the past. She was healing. Quietly. Slowly. But deeply. These letters weren't meant for confrontation. They were confessions, declarations, elegies, and rebirths all at once. And though she had no plans of sending them, they gave her the clarity to face the world again, not as Adam's discarded wife, not as a broken mother, but as herself. The day Grace decided to burn them, it wasn't out of anger, it was ceremony. It was a cool Friday evening. Rachel had taken Elijah to an indoor children's museum with the twins, and Grace had the apartment to herself. She laid the letters gently in a white ceramic bowl on the balcony and lit a single match. One by one, the pages curled and dissolved into ash. The wind carried the remains into the air, scattering them like forgotten melodies across the fading skyline. As the flames danced, Grace felt no regret. Only peace. The final letter she placed into the bowl was left unsigned. It read, "I forgive you. I forgive me. And I'm free." When the fire died, she stood there for a long moment, watching the smoke fade. Then she turned back inside, her steps lighter than they'd been in years. The cello was still in the corner. The music box, unopened, sat on the table. Grace walked to it, placed a hand on its lid, and for the first time since her life imploded, she opened it. A soft, delicate tune filled the room, a song she'd forgotten she loved. She stood there, letting it wash over her, and whispered, "I'm not afraid of my voice anymore." And deep inside, a quiet echo responded, "Then it's time." The community center's music room was no concert hall, but to Grace, it held more meaning than any grand stage ever could. It smelled faintly of old piano keys, aged varnish, and bubble gum from the kids who clung to their instruments like lifelines. Rachel had been asking her to join the Saturday youth choir for weeks, just to observe, to see if she still felt something stir. That morning, Grace agreed, not because she felt ready, but because healing rarely waited for readiness. The room was buzzing with energy as children of all sizes and backgrounds warmed up on violins, guitars, recorders, and shaky voices. Rachel introduced her as Miss Grace, our special guest and a gifted vocalist, to which Grace smiled shyly, her heart pounding beneath her sweater. She stood quietly near the piano, watching as one little girl, Amaya, no older than 10, fumbled nervously with her solo line. Tears welled in the child's eyes when she couldn't match the note. The room grew tense, the air sharp with embarrassment. Grace didn't think. She moved on instinct, kneeling beside her and whispering, "Let's do it together, okay?" Then, without warning, she sang. The sound startled even her. It wasn't just a note, it was a reclamation. Her voice rose, gentle yet full, a river of velvet and strength that quieted every whisper in the room. The children froze. Rachel's jaw dropped. Grace didn't even hear herself at first, only felt the vibration, the release, the freedom. Amaya followed, her shaky voice slowly harmonizing beside her, and soon the entire room joined in, their tiny voices rising in layers around Grace's own. When the final note faded, the silence afterward was thunderous. One child clapped, then another, until the room erupted in cheers. Grace stepped back, breathless, overwhelmed, hands trembling, but not from fear. For the first time in years, she had let her voice out in public. She looked at Rachel, who stood with her hand over her heart, eyes wet with pride. "You didn't just help her," she said softly. "You helped yourself." Grace didn't reply. She couldn't. She just smiled, because something inside her had awoken, not gently, but powerfully, like a voice buried alive clawing back toward the light. Unbeknownst to Grace, a man stood outside the slightly open door of the music room, leaning against the frame with his arms folded and eyes fixed on her with laser focus. Jared Colton, a Grammy-nominated music producer and talent scout known for finding voices in unexpected places, had come to the community center to pick up his niece. He hadn't meant to stop. He hadn't meant to listen. But when he heard Grace sing, he stood frozen, the melody gripping his chest like a forgotten memory. He didn't record it. He didn't approach. Instead, he watched her command the room with grace, not performance. There was no pretense in her tone, no ambition behind her eyes, just pure, unfiltered emotion. When the children dispersed, he slipped out quietly, retrieving her name from the event sheet Rachel had pinned near the door. Grace Wellington. The name stirred something in him, but he couldn't place it. That night, he played the piano in his studio for the first time in weeks, searching for the emotion her voice left behind. Meanwhile, Grace sat by her cello that evening, the music box playing its final note. She didn't know that a door had opened behind her, one that would soon change her life forever. But she could feel something in her chest, a hum, a pull, a whisper. It wasn't just therapy that had brought her back. It wasn't just friends. It was the return of something sacred, her voice. Not the one Adam tried to smother. Not the one she'd buried under fear and duty. But the one that came from pain, from purpose. The voice born in silence, but destined for thunder. Elijah had always preferred the background, sitting cross-legged on the classroom carpet with a comic book, sketching imaginary planets in the margins of his notebooks, quietly observing life from a safe distance. Since the seizures began, Grace noticed how much smaller he'd become, not physically, but in presence. He hesitated before speaking, avoided playgrounds with too much noise, and became visibly anxious during class discussions. But in a surprising twist, it was Miss Callahan, his ever-watchful teacher, who saw something else in him, talent. One day after school, she handed Grace an invitation. We're hosting an art and story showcase. Elijah submitted something. We didn't even know he'd entered. Grace blinked in shock. Elijah hadn't mentioned it. What did he draw? She asked. Miss Callahan smiled. A superhero with a helmet that lights up when his brain misfires. He called him Captain Flicker. Grace's heart clenched. At home, when she gently asked Elijah why he entered, he shrugged and said, I wanted to show people my brain's not broken, it's just wired different. Grace hugged him so tightly he squirmed. You're my hero, you know that, she whispered. You always were. The day of the showcase arrived like a sunrise that had taken years to rise. Grace dressed Elijah in a navy blue sweater, iron khakis, and his favorite sneakers with the lightning bolts on the sides. Rachel and her twins came too, cheering him on like family. The auditorium was filled with proud parents and nervously excited kids, each waiting their turn to show their work. Elijah sat quietly beside Grace, hands clasped tightly. You don't have to speak if you're nervous, she whispered. I'm proud of you already. Elijah looked up at her, his face unreadable, then nodded. But when his name was called, he stood. Slowly. Steadily. He walked to the front, his project displayed behind him on a board full of color, characters, and diagrams about seizures and how the brain works like an electric maze. Then, with a mic in hand, he said, Hi, I'm Elijah Wellington. Some kids think I faint in class because I'm weak. But I'm not. My brain just does. Superhero stuff sometimes. The room erupted in soft laughter and applause. Grace covered her mouth with her hand, overwhelmed by the sight of her son, not just standing, but shining. After the event, people approached Elijah, praising his creativity, shaking his hand. One father said, My daughter has epilepsy too, she needed to hear this today. Elijah beamed. Grace watched from the side, tears in her eyes, marveling at the strength he had found within himself. It wasn't just a victory for him, it was healing for her too. For months, she'd fought for his diagnosis, his medication, his dignity. And now, he stood in front of the world reclaiming it for himself. That evening, after dinner, Grace sat beside Elijah in bed and pulled out her old journal. Can I write a story about today? She asked. Elijah nodded, yawning. But make sure you add the part where I wasn't scared. She smiled. That's the best part. Then, as he drifted off to sleep, she opened her laptop for the first time in weeks and clicked the link Rachel had sent her days ago, open mic night at Luna's Cafe. The video of her singing with Amaya had gone semi-viral. Comments flooded the page. Who is this voice? Where can I find more? One comment stood out. We need more of this woman. Who is she? Jared Colton official. Her heart skipped. She didn't know what the future held, but tonight proved one thing. Both she and Elijah were stronger than anyone had ever believed. And maybe, just maybe, they were meant for something greater than survival. Grace didn't respond to the comment immediately. When she saw Jared Colton official beneath the video of her singing with the children, she stared at it for hours, fingers hovering over the keyboard, unsure what to say. Was it real? A prank? A bot? Rachel confirmed it with a short, stunned gasp. That's the Jared Colton, Grace. He produced Zayn's first EP. He doesn't comment on videos. He signs people. That revelation hit Grace like a wave, equal parts terrifying and thrilling. Days passed before Jared's manager reached out through the cafe's contact form, asking for a call. Grace scheduled it nervously, her voice nearly shaking when she picked up. But Jared's tone was kind, direct, and curious. I didn't mean to stumble into your story, he said. But now I can't stop thinking about it. There's a rawness in your tone. Something no coaching can teach. Grace explained her past, her silence, her struggles, not for pity, but because it was part of her voice now. Jared didn't flinch. That's exactly why I want to work with you, he said. Your voice isn't perfect, it's real. And real is what the world is starving for. Jared offered her a trial development deal. No pressure. Just studio time, a chance to write, and an option to walk away if it felt wrong. Grace hesitated. Music had once been her safe place, but it also became the first thing she sacrificed in marriage. Could she really return to it now? What would it cost? She discussed it with Rachel and Nina over steaming cups of ginger tea. "You're allowed to take up space again," Nina said softly. "You've earned the right to be heard." Grace nodded, fear still clutching her ribs. But the next morning, she signed the contract with trembling hands. Her first session was at a boutique studio in downtown Oakland. The building was tucked between coffee shops and record stores, filled with a quiet warmth and character. When she stepped into the booth and placed the headphones over her ears, she nearly cried. It felt like meeting herself again after years of being missing. She sang a song she'd written in therapy, titled Shatterproof, about rebuilding from betrayal. Jared watched from the booth, arms folded, eyes shining. "We've got something," he whispered to his engineer. Grace stepped out of the booth, wiping her eyes. "How was that?" Jared looked at her, no smile, just truth. It's the kind of voice people don't forget. The next few weeks felt like breathing new air. Grace split her days between Elijah's doctor appointments, therapy, music sessions, and late-night songwriting marathons. She scribbled lyrics on grocery receipts, composed harmonies in the shower, and played cello again like it was a part of her body. Elijah would sit beside her as she practiced, drawing superheroes with musical powers. "You're like Soundwave," he said once, "but good." Grace laughed through tears. One afternoon, Jared surprised her with a small showcase booking, nothing flashy, just a candlelit venue called the Indigo Room, known for launching grassroots legends. "Sing like no one's watching," he said. But the room was packed. Elijah sat front row between Rachel and Nina, bouncing in his seat. When Grace walked onto the stage, dressed in a soft gold blouse and jeans, her heart raced, not from fear, but purpose. She sang Shatterproof for the first time publicly. The audience held their breath. And when she finished, the silence before the applause felt holy. She bowed, breathless. In that moment, it didn't matter where she came from, what she'd lost, or who threw her away. She had built something beautiful from the ruins. And now the world was listening. Adam Wellington had always kept one eye on headlines, especially the tech columns that mattered. It was during his usual scroll through a trending segment on disruptor culture and rising creatives that he saw it. Grace Wellington's voice shatters the room at Indigo Room debut. His name, still attached to hers legally, flashed beside a clip of her on stage, bathed in soft lights, cello in hand, voice soaring through lyrics about pain and perseverance. At first, he scoffed, assuming it was a local blog fluff piece. But as he read the comments, saw the reposts, watched industry veterans share the video with captions like "Real talent always survives," a sour taste bloomed in his mouth. He watched the video again, this time fully. And for the first time since Grace had left, Adam felt something he couldn't code or compartmentalize, regret. But it quickly morphed into something darker, control. If Grace rose to fame while still legally tied to him, what did that mean for his brand? For his clean break narrative? That evening, he called his lawyer and demanded a review of all marital clauses. "There's potential intellectual influence here," he muttered. "She built her image while married to me. My brand can't be entangled in that." It wasn't about love or legacy. It was about image. And Adam wasn't about to let Grace's comeback eclipse his empire. Meanwhile, Grace had no idea what storm was brewing behind the glossy silence of her ex-husband's world. She was too focused on her second studio session, her first radio interview, and finalizing artwork for her EP. Jared's team was working fast but intentionally. There was momentum now, real momentum. Playlists were requesting early tracks. Indie press outlets began emailing inquiries. But amid all the buzz, Grace's priority remained Elijah. She kept his therapy sessions, maintained a healthy routine, and tucked him in every night with his favorite bedtime song, one she'd written herself now. One morning, as she and Jared sat reviewing upcoming tour options, she received an envelope via courier. No return address. Inside was a cease and desist notice. It claimed unauthorized use of identity and brand association, citing her legal surname and her performance materials. At first, Grace laughed, thinking it was a mistake. But the document was signed and real, and tied to Adam's legal team. Her stomach twisted. Rachel and Nina were furious, Jared was livid. "He's trying to scare you," Jared said. "This is posturing. Don't fall for it." Grace, however, didn't fall apart. She took the letter, calmly folded it, and whispered, "I've already lost everything he could take. He doesn't scare me anymore." But that didn't mean she wouldn't fight. Jared immediately activated his legal team, bringing in entertainment lawyer Danielle Ortiz, a fierce negotiator known for dismantling intimidation tactics in the industry. Danielle reviewed the paperwork and smirked. "Typical. He's bluffing, hoping you'll fold under pressure. But what he doesn't realize is, you're not the woman he left behind." They filed a countersuit for defamation and interference. Grace didn't want money. She wanted her name back, her voice free, her peace protected. The legal chess game took weeks. During that time, trolls emerged online, anonymous comments mocking her past, suggesting she was using her son's illness for sympathy. Grace stayed silent, but her music didn't. She released a stripped-back video titled Unshaken, a haunting, one-take performance recorded in Rachel's backyard. It went viral overnight. The message was clear: no legal paper could mute her anymore. When the case was quietly dismissed, Adam's team issued a half-hearted withdrawal. He lost the battle, but more importantly, he realized he'd lost the only person who had ever loved him without conditions. Grace didn't celebrate with champagne or press statements. She simply took Elijah to the beach, let him run barefoot across the sand, and stood there watching the waves, cello case by her side, as her past finally surrendered to the tide. The storm had passed. And ahead, shimmering on the horizon, was something far greater, her shine. The lights were warmer than she remembered. Not harsh like the blinding ones from her past, when spotlights symbolized pressure rather than purpose, but soft, golden, and alive. The New York Indie Art Showcase was one of the most respected stages for upcoming artists on the East Coast, and Grace stood at the edge of it, wearing a flowing white blouse, sleek black slacks, and the quiet strength of a woman who had died once and come back with a voice stronger than steel. Her debut EP, Reclaimed, had dropped just days prior, climbing charts faster than anyone expected. But this showcase wasn't about numbers. It was about declaration. Jared stood backstage, hands in his pockets, his usual cool demeanor replaced with proud anticipation. "You don't owe them perfection," he had told her before the curtain rose. "You just owe them honesty." Grace nodded, gripping the mic with both hands as the hush fell over the crowd. Her first note was low, steady, drenched in everything she'd carried: betrayal, survival, motherhood, rediscovery. Each lyric bled with intention. By the time she reached the final chorus of Shatterproof, the room was on its feet, not clapping, standing, eyes glistening, hearts open. Grace didn't bow. She simply closed her eyes, whispered thank you, and walked off stage into the arms of her new world. Elijah had been backstage, wearing his favorite noise-canceling headphones, doodling in his sketchpad while seated between Rachel and Nina. When Grace returned from the performance, he jumped into her arms, wrapping his small hands around her neck with a proud grin. "I heard the whole thing, Mommy. Through the walls. You sounded like a real hero." His words made her chest ache in the most beautiful way. Back at the hotel that night, Jared surprised her with a private listening session, a montage of reactions from fans, industry experts, and even artists who had reached out after hearing her EP. "You're not a whisper anymore," he said. "You're a wave." The album was being streamed globally. Promoters were calling. Label heads were requesting meetings. But what stunned Grace most was how personal the messages were: women from shelters, parents of children with chronic illnesses, artists who had walked away from their dreams. "Your voice brought mine back to life," one message read. Grace replied to every single one herself. Not out of obligation, but out of gratitude. Her voice had once been a secret. Now, it was a bridge. Later that week, during an exclusive interview with Pulse magazine, the host asked, "You've faced betrayal, motherhood under pressure, even legal threats, yet here you are. How would you define yourself now?" Grace paused, eyes steady. "Not as a victim. And not just a survivor. I'm a woman who stopped waiting for permission to exist." The quote went viral within hours. On social media, the hashtag Reclaimed Grace trended globally. But beyond the screens and headlines, Grace kept her rhythm rooted in reality. She still picked Elijah up from school, still joined Rachel and Nina for Sunday brunches, still played her cello every night before bed. Fame wasn't the destination, it was just the microphone through which her truth was finally being amplified. And in that amplification, she found peace, not because the world had accepted her, but because she had finally accepted herself. That night, as she stood on the hotel balcony staring at the New York skyline, Elijah asleep beside the bed, her phone buzzed with a call from a music legend requesting a collaboration. She smiled, but didn't answer. She turned instead to her journal, opened a new page, and wrote, "This is just the beginning. The encore hasn't even started." For a man who once controlled rooms with nothing more than his silence, Adam Wellington now found himself unable to control even the walls closing in around him. What began as a subtle whisper in tech circles had now erupted into a full-blown federal investigation. Anonymous whistleblowers had tipped off the Securities and Exchange Commission, alleging insider trading and manipulation of investor data within Wellington Dynamics, the very company Adam built to define his legacy. His office, once a symbol of dominance with its floor-to-ceiling windows and minimalist art, now felt like a glass prison. He stared at the cease and desist withdrawal letter his attorneys had quietly settled with Grace's team and felt an unfamiliar twinge, powerlessness. The media hadn't yet connected his name to the legal retreat, but he knew it was only a matter of time. The same name now appearing in headlines alongside Grace Wellington, the woman he had once discarded like a nuisance, was now the very name drowning him. Her voice, her story, her strength, she was no longer a shadow in his narrative. She was a blazing sun, and his empire was beginning to melt under its light. At a board meeting scheduled to be routine, Adam was blindsided by a unanimous vote of no confidence. Investors had lost trust. Shareholders demanded transparency. And his once loyal CFO, Mitchell Crane, now sat across the table, pushing forward a motion to freeze Adam's executive privileges pending legal review. "We can't afford to be dragged into your personal scandals or regulatory liabilities," Mitchell said coldly. "You've become a liability, Adam. Not an asset." Adam laughed bitterly. "You think this company exists without me?" he barked. But no one responded. The silence wasn't reverent anymore, it was condemning. Within days, the media caught wind of the shakeup. Tech blogs that once praised his brilliance now questioned his ethics. Anonymous exposés trickled into public forums, former employees speaking of a toxic environment, of emotional manipulation, of a man who built a kingdom on fear and detachment. Adam tried to reach out to Claudia, his mother, but she replied only with a text, "Maybe now you understand what it feels like to be cut off." That night, he sat alone in the penthouse he used to share with Grace, watching her sing on national television, wearing the name she was never supposed to make shine. And for the first time, he wept. Not for her. For himself. Desperation clawed at him like a slow, growing infection. He began making calls to old partners, silent investors, PR firms. No one picked up. Jared Colton's name was now everywhere, tied to Grace's album, and Adam's attempt to stir controversy had only made her story stronger. On a late Thursday evening, he wandered into a bar in Palo Alto wearing a baseball cap low over his eyes, trying to disappear into the shadows. There, he saw his reflection in the polished marble of the bar top, not the genius, not the icon, but a hollow man whose brilliance could no longer protect him from the fallout of his cruelty. The bartender, unaware of who he was, offered him a drink on the house, citing that he looked like he needed it. Adam didn't refuse. He stared at the glass, swirling the amber liquid, and remembered the night he told Grace she and Elijah were distractions. At the time, he believed it. Now, he realized she had been the anchor to everything good in him, his last tether to anything human. Without her, without Elijah, without purpose, he was just another man swallowed by the very silence he used to weaponize. And that silence was louder than ever. The fall wasn't sudden. It had always been coming. He just never imagined that Grace's rise would be the thunder announcing it. Grace had just finished rehearsing for an upcoming performance in Chicago when her assistant handed her a note scribbled hastily on a torn napkin. "Adam Wellington is in the building. Waiting near the loading dock." For a moment, she didn't react. Her fingers simply froze mid-air, hovering over the zipper of her cello case. She hadn't spoken to Adam since the cease and desist debacle. His name alone brought no tremble now, only a dull reminder of the life she had walked away from and rebuilt from rubble. Jared noticed her pause. "You don't have to go out there," he said gently. "Not everything needs closure." But Grace shook her head. Not for him, for her. She walked through the narrow backstage hallway in silence, heels echoing against the concrete, past equipment cases and stagehands laughing under dim lights. When she stepped into the night air by the loading dock, she found him leaning against the brick wall in a coat too thin for the chill. He looked smaller. Not physically, but internally, like someone who had been emptied from the inside out. "Grace," he said, standing straighter as she approached. Thank you for coming." She didn't respond. She waited. "I've lost everything," Adam began, his voice hoarse. "The company. The board. The investors. Claudia won't even return my calls. I know I deserve it. All of it. But I need to say this. I was wrong." His voice cracked on the last word, as if it resisted being spoken. "You gave me love. You gave me a son. A family. And I discarded it like it meant nothing. I called you a burden. I called Elijah a distraction." He took a step closer, tears brimming in his tired eyes. "But the truth is, I was the burden. I was the one too weak to hold anything real. I see that now." Grace stood perfectly still. She didn't flinch. She didn't soften. She had waited years, through pain, therapy, humiliation, for this man to say what should have been said long ago. And yet, now that the apology came, it felt weightless. Late. Like rain after a fire had already burned down the house. "You came all this way for that?" she asked softly. He looked up, startled. "Yes," he admitted. "To tell you I'm sorry. And to ask if, maybe, somehow, you could ever forgive me." Silence stretched between them like a rope. Grace took a long breath. The air was thick with memory. She stared at the man who once broke her, dismantled her confidence piece by piece, and now stood before her, shattered by his own doing. "I forgive you," she said finally, watching his shoulders sag with relief. "But not for you. For me. Because I refuse to carry your shame any longer." Her voice, calm yet resolute, pierced more than any scream. "You gave me silence when I needed sound. You turned your back when your son needed holding. You can't unwrite that." Adam blinked, a tear slipping down his cheek. "I know," he whispered. "And I'll live with it every day." Grace turned to leave, then paused, her back still to him. "Elijah is thriving. He speaks with confidence now. He draws heroes and puts my name on their capes. You weren't there to see it. But I was. I always will be." She walked away then, back into the warm hallway lined with instruments and laughter. Adam remained at the dock, the cold biting through his coat, the apology, though genuine, floating like ash in the air. Some words, Grace knew, couldn't rebuild bridges. They only stood at the water's edge, whispering to a tide that had already moved on. The house sat nestled in a quiet valley just outside Napa, surrounded by sloping hills, lemon trees, and the kind of peaceful silence Grace once feared but now cherished. It wasn't enormous or extravagant like Adam's glass and marble monument to success. No. This home was designed for warmth, not display. It had arched windows that let the sunrise spill gently into every room, a wraparound porch where Elijah could watch birds with a sketchpad in hand, and most importantly, a soundproof music room at its heart. That music room was Grace's dream realized, custom-built with cello stands, shelves of blank composition books, a corner vocal booth, and string lighting that made the ceiling glow like constellations. Jared had helped secure the property, calling it an investment in your legacy. But Grace didn't see it as a reward. She saw it as a promise kept, to herself, to Elijah, to every version of her that cried in silence but never quit. When they moved in, Elijah ran barefoot across the hallway tiles, yelling, "Mommy, it feels like a song." Grace laughed, tears in her eyes. It did. Every inch of the place sang of freedom. Nina and Rachel arrived 2 weeks later with takeout, throw pillows, and enough scented candles to launch a small spa. They didn't come as guests, they came as family. Together, the three women stood in the new kitchen, wine glasses raised in celebration. To beginnings, Rachel toasted. Not new, Grace corrected with a smile. To earned. That night, they hosted what Rachel cheekily called a rebirth party, an intimate gathering of the women from the support group, Marco and Tamika with Zoe, a few musicians Grace had mentored, and Jared, who brought a portable speaker and played Grace's acoustic version of Unshaken. No fancy lighting, no stage. Just community. Love. Truth. As music drifted into the night air, Elijah stood up in the middle of the backyard and presented Grace with a crayon drawing, a giant stage with a stick figure at a cello, a crowd cheering below, and a tiny boy in the corner wearing a cape. At the top, it read, "My mom's my hero." Grace pressed the paper to her chest, overwhelmed by the quiet power of that moment. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was returning to anything. She was home, finally, fully, irrevocably home. Later that night, when the guests had left and the house had gone still, Grace stood barefoot in the music room, staring out the tall arched window as moonlight poured across the floor. The cello rested beside her, gleaming softly. Elijah had fallen asleep in his new room upstairs, walls covered with glow-in-the-dark stars and superhero posters. Jared lingered in the doorway, hesitant. "You've done it," he said. "You've built something no one can tear down." Grace turned to him, not with pride, but peace. "I didn't build it alone," she replied. "You gave me space. My friends gave me courage. My son gave me fire." He nodded, then smiled. "And you gave us music." As he stepped away, she sat down, cello between her knees, fingers poised over the strings. She began to play, not for an audience, not for a label, but for herself. Each note poured from her like water, washing over every scar, every memory, every storm she had once drowned beneath. When she finally paused, eyes closed, breathing steady, she whispered, This is the sound of coming back." Outside, the wind stirred gently through the lemon trees, the stars blinked above, and within those walls, filled with melodies and new memories, Grace Wellington, mother, musician, survivor, was no longer rebuilding. She was rising. The lights of the Grammy Awards stage shimmered like a galaxy of redemption as Grace stood center stage, the statuette warm in her hand, her eyes shimmering with tears that refused to fall. Behind her, a screen replayed clips from her journey, her cello, her open mic performance, her debut album cover, flashes of everything she had survived and conquered. The applause was thunderous, rising not from fame or trend, but from resonance. Her song Shatterproof had become a global anthem, embraced by survivors, dreamers, and broken hearts learning to beat again. She had walked onto that stage not just as a nominee, but as proof that pain could become power, that abandonment could become art. As she leaned toward the mic, she didn't give the traditional speech. Instead, she closed her eyes, held the award close to her chest, and softly said, "This is for every woman who was called a burden. Every child made to feel like their illness made them unlovable. And for every voice told to stay quiet, I hope you scream. I hope you sing." The crowd rose again, not because it was required, but because it was deserved. Grace left the stage that night not with just a trophy, but with the echo of millions singing back her truth. Backstage, Elijah waited, seated beside Rachel and Nina, wearing a tailored burgundy suit and gold headphones, his feet swinging beneath the velvet seat. When he saw Grace, he leapt up, running toward her with the kind of joy only a child untouched by fame could bring. "Mommy! You did it," he squealed, wrapping his arms around her waist. "We did it," she corrected, kissing the crown of his head. Rachel hugged them both, tears streaming. Nina beamed with pride, taking a dozen photos with her phone while whispering, "You were meant for this, G." Later that night, as they rode back to the hotel in a black SUV, Elijah curled up beside her, drawing doodles of golden microphones and stars. Grace gazed out the window, the Los Angeles skyline passing like a memory she no longer feared. Her phone buzzed again, new contract offers, invitations to speak, collab requests, but she silenced them all. Tonight was not for business. It was for breath. For celebration. For a quiet kind of gratitude. Her heart no longer raced from survival, it beat steady with purpose. She had already won far more than the industry could offer. She had reclaimed her name, her son's future, her soul's sound. And she wasn't done yet. The next morning, in the early light before dawn, Grace sat on the balcony of her suite, cello resting beside her, Elijah still fast asleep inside. The city was quiet, wrapped in a hush that only early risers and dreamers understood. She wrote a single line in her journal: "I am no longer waiting to be chosen, I have chosen myself." As birds stirred and the sun climbed the sky, her phone buzzed with a message from Jared: "World tour confirmed. Headliner. We leave in 6 weeks." She smiled, closed the journal, and whispered, "Let's begin again." There was no fear in her voice now. Only music. Only hope. Only grace. She walked back into the suite, kissed Elijah's forehead, and picked up her cello, plucking a soft melody that danced through the room like a sunrise. The world had once tried to silence her, but she had become a symphony. And this was just the overture. The past had shaped her, yes, but it would never define her again. Because in this chapter of her life, the spotlight wasn't a weapon, it was a mirror. And the woman it reflected was no longer invisible. She was unforgettable. The end.